tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Bonsoir. On behalf of FRENZ and FRENZ School and all the volunteering parents that have managed to pull this event tonight, we'd like to welcome you warmly. I know it's a bit cold outside, and thank you for making the time tonight and organizing all the babysitting and all the stuff. It's a great honor for us to have so many people, and to be absolutely honest, on Monday we had about 50 people registered, and we ended up tonight probably was 120. So we're hopefully going to be able to accommodate everyone. Look, tonight the seminar will help us to gain some more insight about bilingual education. And as a parent, I've got myself 2 daughters that have gone through these pathways, and I cannot value it enough. And I think we always think, oh, speaking one of the heritage languages at home is enough. It probably was, from my opinion, but when we've last met with John at one of our committee and hearing all the good stuff he was talking about, say, look John, let's try to take the opportunity and open up this whole discussion to the wider, so hence the seminar tonight. So we hope you're going to get a lot out of today. John McCaffery has been in the bilingual research for a long time, probably longer than I've been in New Zealand. John is a senior lecturer at the School of Curriculum and Pedagogy at the Faculty specifically of Education at Auckland University. He has been, for the one that have shown some interest in his very prolific in article. He's been advisors in different fields, and he will touch base later on this. He's currently still doing your doctorate, yeah?
Like that.
The title of it is around simultaneous biliteracy at Richmond Road School in Maori, Samoan and French context, and has been looking at the school, how we got, so giving him a very good fertile ground of learning. So John is going to share with us his expertise around bilingual education, the latest research. For myself, I'm Frank Ridon. I'm the president of FRENZ School, which is a charity, not-for-profit association, which has been going for about 20 years. This year is the 20th anniversary, and we're very proud. It's all started at Richmond Road School once upon a time, and it's still going very well. Look, as I said, I cannot thank the different stakeholders across that journey that from the school that have embraced the bilingual education, to the community, to the parents, to the teachers, and various stakeholders to make this happen. I think as a dad, be able to see my girls now understanding fluently my jokes, my slang, and when I'm grumpy, I can tell you that they are fluent. So just to give you an insight before I hand over to John, look, FRENZ is here to help and support bilingual education, probably more in French and English, across 2 primary schools in Auckland. That's with a preschool, a network of preschool combined already today, about 190 children. And this is growing, so there is really some demand for bilingual education, and I'm sure amongst some of you tonight, in your language, in your culture, there is as well the same. So take the opportunity tonight to enjoy the conference. What I'd like to do is as well thank Spark Foundation that have kindly lended us their facilities to organize this. This is a very costly facilities, but they have giving it for free tonight, so I'd like to thank them on your behalf. So on that note, I'd like to give a warm welcome to John for a very insightful presentation. Thank you.
Well, kia ora tātou, tuatahi te mihi atu kia Frank, kia FRENZ, mō rātou pōheri atu nei, kia hau, kia māwaka Judy, kia haramai nei, tēnei ahi ki te kōrero rero, mā take pāna ki ki te reo ruatanga hakaupapa tēnei, kare mi kia tātou puta no te motu tai atu ki te whai au o tira mihi mai rā Frank. Tūrua, me te mata tātou ka lotu i ngā kupu o te atua kutuku i o mai ke tātou. Kia koutou. I wanted just to start with the issues surrounding tangata whenua. The 1972 petition to Parliament is really the beginnings of the modern Māori language revival movement, and before that time Te Reo Māori Society and Richard Benton were arguing that we needed bilingual immersion education if Te Reo was going to survive. So just pay our respects tonight to those people, some who have now died. The most recent person from this group, Poropoaki kia Rawiri Rangi Tauwira, not Te Arawa, he has been the most recent member of the group, Hakupata Whata from Kaikohe from Taitokerau. But people who trod that path to Parliament to see that we could have bilingual education. My story is a little bit different. My grandparents and all my family are originally from Ireland, from Donegal, so I'm an O'Donnell. So for more than 1,000 years my family grew up in a setting where people from outside Ireland wanted to impose their religion, their beliefs, their language and their values on the Irish. And my particular branch of the family is in the northwest, and they resisted vigorously, to put it mildly. So my grandfather came to New Zealand, and my grandparents probably in chains to Australia, and then came across with the Chinese gold miners to Otago. But they brought with them that sense that they hadn't come all the way around the world to just recreate the old world of Europe. My grandfather used to say to me, you know, if we wanted intolerance and bigotry and people who didn't like other people's languages or cultures, we would have stayed an island boy because there's plenty of it there, you know. So I grew up with my grandfather and my parents saying to me, you know, we're here for something else. Well, I had no idea what that else was, but they sent me off to Tonga to work in volunteer service abroad, and then to learn Māori at Victoria University with Tipino Regan and Koro Jews and the crowd from there. And then to go teaching in Māori-speaking areas for a while, and eventually I got the hang of what I was meant to be doing. So I guess that's how I got into it. And of course, my lovely wife Julie is here tonight, and she is a great help to us. So we're a blended Tongan, Samoan, Irish and Italian family, and we have great wishes for our children and our grandchildren to have access to the dreams and hopes that all of our ancestors had when they came here to Aotearoa. So tonight we're going to have a look at perhaps some new understandings about bilingualism, some implications for languages, education and families, some issues for bilingual immersion education itself, and maybe some ideas for what we can do to foster greater bilingualism in our families and communities. But it can only be a start. You know, a 1.5 hour session, we can't cover everything. So we're hoping to enthuse you, so you'll go away and follow up on the PowerPoint. Frank says we can get the PowerPoint up onto the website, the FRENZ website in some way. And I don't think there's any chance we'll cover all the material in it, but you should be able to download it and follow that up. So I'm hoping that we'll have a bit more of an interactive session here with some of the activities we've got, and the background information you can go have a further look at. So on activity 1, you've got an A3 sheet on your table, and it asks you to list out the views on bilingualism that exist in the New Zealand community. The great, the good, the bad and the ugly. So if you could, 2 sheets per table sometimes, if you could just appoint a recorder and just brainstorm, mind map what the New Zealand community is saying about bilingualism. bilingual immersion education. So if you could just brainstorm all the ideas that you can get. There should be 2 sheets on each table, 2 working groups. It'll be great. A quick 3.5 minutes. What did we say? All right, I think that's it.
So it's open our mind to the world. Bilingualism.
A few ideas per table, huh, shall we? So we had a great.
We had a great.
An ugly one, some would probably think that it's forced upon.
It is confusing for children, those who are against. Te reo is not spoken anywhere else. What's the point? Or people come to New Zealand to speak English.
Positive. It's important for identity and confidence in our children. Learning their heritage, such as Wha Samoa, is should be learned in their language, and preservation of their heritage and language.
So thank you, Phil. Yep, clearly. So probably the saddest one came out this week from Internal Affairs, from the Ethnic Affairs section of Internal Affairs, where the advice on their website and on their booklet is that if migrants or new arrivals to New Zealand wish to integrate and be part of New Zealand, they probably should speak English to their children at home. Yeah. So that's the biggest worry. So it tells you that that's the advice being given by Internal Affairs to new migrants and to new migrant services. We do have a fair way to go. Yeah. So that's the ugly bit. For Judy and I and our family, the goal of bilingualism is not really about academic achievement or schooling. It's really about empowering this generation to be able to raise their children in our own languages and cultures. That's what's important. After all, what's the point of the children coming to school, or the parents coming to school, and going home speaking English to their children, and then sending their children to school to learn the same language that they learned at school, and then each generation raising its children in English but sending them back to school to learn the language. So we really need intergenerational transmission. That's really what we need. And so rather than thinking just about school and the effect of school, we need to think about that big wider picture of society and family and friends and networks, and how we can get those networks and family to be supportive of bilingualism. And I think we really know how to do that. But there's often an argument about why families themselves can't retain their own languages, and that's a big misunderstanding. The argument is often, speak your own language at home and send your children to school to learn English. Yes, well, it doesn't quite work like that, because nowhere in the world are minorities able to keep their languages going beyond 3 generations. All right? Once you get to 3 generations, then you need the support of the state through early childhood and immersion education. And if you don't have the support of the state, the languages rapidly disappear. Because like me, first generation, my grandfather and grandfathers and grandparents, everyone was Irish, spoke Gaelic. They came here, spoke Gaelic to my father and to his father, you know, on the other side of the family. But they were put to shame by the people who were here, who said, you know, speak English, speak English, speak English. And so my father understood Gaelic but didn't speak it. I'm the 3rd generation, so what do I get from my father? Nothing. So that's the migrant story around the world. So it's not possible to do that. And some recent research that Judy and I have been doing in the Pacific is showing us that, in fact, people raise their children in the language that they went to school in. It's not the language that their parents speak at home, it's the language they went to school in. So communities in the Pacific who send their children to all early English, early childhood, all English primary schools and all English secondary schools, as many of the church schools are, and some of the government schools are raising their children most of those peoples appear to be raising their children all in English. So that would be a major development if we could get enough research to show, you know, to prove that within New Zealand anyway, and the Pacific, which is our area of interest, the language that you raise your children in is the language that you went to school in. One thing we do know is that bilingual students are blessed with bilingual brains, And I think that's a lovely phrase, and I've been wanting for some time to suggest to Richmond Road that it should copyright the phrase, put it on the t-shirts and sell them for the Roku to make money, because it would be a huge seller around the world, and if you hold the copyright for it, that would be just great. And it's a phrase that people are always coming up to us after presentations and saying, can we put that on our t-shirts, can we have that for our flag? And we said, no, it belongs to Richmond Road. So there we are. Okay, so just some meanings in this presentation. L1 means first language or mother tongue, the language of infancy. HL means your heritage language, even though whether or not it's a first language for you. So for me, Gaelic is my heritage language. For many Māori students, Māori is their heritage language, but they're English speakers. For a growing number of Pacific children, Samoan or Tongan or Cook Island or Vangahau Niue is their heritage language, but they're growing up first language speakers of English. So a heritage language is the language of your family and your grandparents and your traditions. A second language is a language that's learned after infancy, and infancy is generally defined as around about age 6 or 7. So any language learned after 6 or 7 is generally considered to be a second language. Any language learned before that is considered to be a first language or a mother tongue. But of course you can have 2 first languages, as many children do. You have 3 first languages actually, providing they learned in infancy before the age of 6 or 7. So we have a new scientific breakthrough recently been announced and resolved actually, and it is that monolingualism is a curable disease. Yes. All right, so we've got a little couple of clips to show you, but to do this I couldn't get them to play in it, so I have to go out for a minute and bring them up. The cat comes up, looks at the fish, licks its lips. The fish looks at the cat and woof, 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 and barks at it. And the answer is, isn't it a great value to be bilingual? Yeah. So we'll perhaps try and get that sound back for you by the end. Okay, so there are some really important things about bilingualism that our monolingual system doesn't realise, and I think Colin Baker's statement here sums it up very well. He talks about a monolingual and a bilingual as being similar to a sprinter and a high jumper, and that each person is an expert in their own discipline. Each person can jump, but we wouldn't compare them. We wouldn't say one person's gold medal is better than another, and yet they're both experts. So the hurdler concentrates on 2 different skills, sprinting and high jumping, trying to combine a high standard in both. With only a few exceptions, the hurdler will be unable to sprint as fast as the sprinter or jump as high as the high jumper. But this is not to say that the hurdler is a worse athlete. So what he's saying is the bilingual has a much more complex task to do and does it very well, but should not necessarily or always be compared with monolinguals. Right? And a very good example of that is vocabulary. Is a bilingual people and adults and competent students have a vocabulary size way larger than a monolingual person. However, in each particular language, the vocabulary of that language is usually smaller than the vocabulary of the monolingual. So the monolingual French person would have a larger vocabulary than a bilingual person who's bilingual in French, but overall, the bilingual has a much bigger vocabulary because they draw on 2 languages. So how do you compare that? That's what Baker's saying. And he says we really should not be in the position of doing that. So becoming bilingual involves becoming proficient in the languages and literacies for the purposes that they're needed. And we can have one big, strong language, and we can have one small, weak language. But we'd be much better if we had 2 languages that were reasonably balanced or reasonably strong, providing, of course, the people who design the bike know what they're doing. And that is really a major problem for us in New Zealand, is that everything about the New Zealand education system has been designed by monolinguals for bilinguals. And it's a constant cause of friction for every community and every school that tries to run programs. So this knowledge that we're talking about tonight is really important, because what we need to do is to get knowledge about bilingualism out there so that the people who are designing the systems and making the rules and making the decisions for our children actually have a greater understanding about how to do it and what's involved in it. And that's not it's not a criticism of anyone in particular, but it's just what you would expect, you know, from that people who are monolingual find it very difficult to walk, you know, a mile in a bilingual shoes, because they can keep walking, but only one language still comes out their mouth. So, yeah. So to do that, we'll need far greater knowledge about bilingualism and biliteracy, and we really need to all enrol in that. And so the biggest challenge for many programs is trying to run a bilingual program in a largely monolingual, monoliterate education society, simply because the assumptions that are made are based on assumptions drawn from monolingualism. So, however, there are many researchers, probably the most famous of whom is Jim Cummins, who argues that bilingualism and bilingual students are talented and advantaged and should not be seen as a problem to the system or be judged in terms of deficit of what they don't have, but rather seen as bringing really important resources. So in our second activity tonight, you have to send 3 runners, it says. We can send 2 or 3 to other tables to politely request from those tables in a heritage language other than English, 1 myth at a time about bilingualism. So you have on the table a series of these little pieces of paper, and you have a master sheet that has the myths on. And you have to go to other tables, your runners have to go to other tables. They have to greet people politely. For sure, they cannot reach in the table and snatch or grab. They must ask politely, and they must greet everybody in the group. And then there must be an exchange of greetings, and you come back with one of these myths, and you have a glue stick on your table, and you glue the myth over the one that you've got here. And within the time we've got, the winning group is the group that has most of the sections completed, and they're the ones who clean the tables and pick up the pieces. Okay, so, away you go. So just have a quick look. And in your group, pick one myth. Pick one of those myths, and we're going to have a quiz on the myths.
Once my child has learned the language, he or she will never forget it. Children often lose languages they do not continue to practice. This happens all the time. To be bilingual for life, be sure your children continue to practice their languages either with you, playmates, other family members, or in close and frequent social circles like church or community groups.
So really important for Richmond Road that children who finish at year 6 go into a year 7 and 8 program, and then into a secondary program, because the people who they date and marry are going to be huge influences on how their children are raised. So if we don't have strong support in secondary education for bilingualism and for our languages, even though they've done it all at Richmond Road or done it up to year 6, they will not raise their children in those languages. That's the suggestion. So we need to make sure that we keep our children, and especially our teenagers, involved in our communities of language. Yeah. Great. Pick a second one, just at random.
My child will learn my language when he's older because he'll visit my country. First, if a visit is the bulk of the child's experience in the language, he or she is unlikely to develop fluency in the language, even if the visit is a long one. If language practice continues after a visit or 2 to 3 months, during which the child is hearing and using the target language each day, then this may help the child to develop fluency.
I mean, the other one is I'll let my child choose for themselves what language they want to learn later in life. Of course, we know what language they'll be speaking by that time. Yeah. So one of the things that's worth knowing about when we think about how we're going to organise language for our families and our communities is this term called diglossia. Societies that use different languages for different purposes tend to retain their languages far better than those who try to use just one language for all purposes. In other words, if it doesn't matter which language you use for all purposes, why would you bother to learn two? Right? So the research says if there's a reason for having to use two languages, because one is for family and church, and one is for community and heritage, and one is for this, and one is for sport, and one is for something else, then people will learn two languages if there's a purpose for it. But if everything in society and family can be done with just one language, why would you bother to learn the other one? So the research is pretty clear. It's not popular with many groups who would like rather to think that they might remain monolingual in a bilingual society. But in essence, the societies that plan to use different languages for different purposes tend to retain their languages longer, we're talking about generations, than do communities where people try and spread the language across everything, try and make the heritage language do everything. So therefore it suggests that it's a good idea to sort of plan for language use and decide that at certain times, at certain places, with certain people, this is the language that should be used. And at other times, in other places, that's so with your friends, that's fine, you use English. When you're at home with the family and your grandparents and whatever, then you use French or Māori or Samoan or whatever. Yeah. So that's worth thinking about in terms of planning, because there isn't a society anywhere which is bilingual that has managed to restrict its children to speaking only one language. So you can see what the problem is. Yeah, if you try and restrict them just to speak the heritage language, but everything in society can be done in English, then they will in fact just wind up using English. All right, so there are two sorts of bilingualism as well. Subtractive bilingualism, which takes away children's home languages and replaces it with a world language or a regional language, or additive bilingualism that adds a heritage language to the world language, or adds a world language to the heritage language. So the only form of education system that works is really additive bilingualism. This system of trying to take away children's home languages and replace them with English tends to lead to loss of identity, doubts in self-concept, and in many cases educational failure. And the biggest example we've got in New Zealand, of course, is the Māori experience, isn't it? 160 years of people trying to take the language away and replace it with English. And now, of course, we're doing the same thing with Pacific languages, telling Pacific people they should be speaking English only, trying to take the languages away and replace them with English only. And so the outcomes of that are pretty common. And the reason for that was the views that people held about bilingualism. So we shouldn't sort of reify academia and research, and we should be critical of it, because these views that bilingualism was a problem and a handicap came from researchers and academics. And in the 19th century, in both the English and the French-speaking worlds, it seems bilingualism was seen as a problem and a handicap. So if language was the soil in which intelligence grows, two languages produce thin soil, and monolingualism a much richer and fertile one. In other words, there's only enough room in the brain for one language, and two languages will draw on cognitive capacity and language ability and restrict the development of one language. So that had a whole lot of weight in those times. And of course, societies have done all sorts of terrible things to people who speak other languages. People in Samoa in particular were sent out to pick up valfefe, which is a thorny weed like a blackberry, until your hands bled for speaking Samoan in school, or sent out with the cane knife for hours to cut grass until your hands were blistered and bleeding. Students are strapped, and when I worked in Samoa in the late 90s, students were still being strapped for speaking Samoan in school. So we exported these views from Western Europe into many of the places that we went, and when we ask ourselves why do some of our communities, why are they so ambivalent about that, the answer lies in the history and heritage that we left them, and it's called hegemony, isn't it? When people come to believe that they are the cause of their own problem, right? And of course Samoa got its independence in 1962, but in the late 90s people were still being beaten for speaking Samoan at school, so yeah. All right, so we've got it there. We've talked a little bit about identity in texts. and we shouldn't underrate identity. Identity is probably the single most important reason for young children starting early in a language, because they grow up to be the language that they speak. And if we want our children to have secure identities in our family culture and who we are, then we need to start that really early. It's too late by 6 or 7 or 8 or 9 for children to be thinking about who they are. They're deciding who they are at 18 months, 2, 3 and 4. And by 5, they're pretty sure about who they are and who they will be in the world. So it's really important that we don't delay language learning and teaching from our purposes. All right, so this view represented itself in this way, and you'll see it here, as 2 separate balloons in the brain, in which each language and cognitive system was stored separately. And because there was no connection between the 2, or they believed there was no connection between the 2, there was no advantage in being bilingual. So what you learnt in one language couldn't be used in the other. And then the idea was that what you would have to do is pop one of the languages in order to make sure, that there's enough room in the brain for the other one to grow. So it's sometimes called a balloon theory, but it had tragic consequences because generally the one that was popped wasn't English, it was heritage languages, indigenous languages. But it had a great deal of scientific currency, and until the late 1960s it was still in the textbooks for linguistics and for language education that this was how languages are organised and cognitive systems. But we now have a lot of evidence to tell us that that's not correct. All right? So our newer research and understanding shows us that there's just one central processing system in the brain for processing language and cognition. Right? And that languages will flow in through as many channels as we like, through 1 channel, 2 channels, or 3 channels, and that all those languages will feed the same cognitive system. So the child who stays home with their nana and family at home, doing rich, interesting things at home, getting rich, interesting information in the family language, is not worse off. That child does not have to go to early childhood in English in order to be clever. That child is acquiring concepts and knowledge regardless of what language that concepts and knowledge comes in at. Knowledge does not just arrive in English only. You know, the English-speaking world thinks that knowledge can only be obtained in English, but they forget that most of the world is bilingual. And most people gain knowledge about the world and themselves through multiple channels. But there's only one central cognitive processing system, and sometimes it can be represented like that. So the brain is said to have only one central processing system. It creates networks to link up with ideas that are developed from both languages. And so bilingualism can therefore be seen as an enormous advantage because, I'll just show you, because it's sometimes thought about like an iceberg where you have 2 separate languages, the surface features of the language up here, but underneath the surface you have a common underlying proficiency, a think tank, a cognitive system in which the ideas about the world and knowledge and academic learning is growing regardless of what language it's being done in, and therefore it's available to use in any language that you know once you reach a certain threshold in it. So do children have to learn twice as much? No. Right? It's pretty much well established now that what we can do is we can show children how to transfer knowledge that they've learned through one language and use it in the other language. In other words, concepts are transferable, and quite a good way to think about it is learning to drive. If you learn to drive in New Zealand, you go to France or Samoa or anywhere, you don't learn to drive again. Learning to drive is a transferable skill. You just learn the new words that you need for the road signs and the knowledge to be a driver. Once you know how to pull a chair out from under a table and sit down, you don't have to learn it in 2 different languages. It's a transferable skill. And so the same is true of cognition and mathematics and academic learning. The academic world of knowledge for children is full of transferable skills. But what people in the past did was draw a line through the middle of the child and say, this is your English half and this is your Māori side, or this is your Samoan side and this is your English side. Leave your family language at the gate and learn English, and it's no use to you, it won't get you a job. So we create an artificial psychological barrier for the child between the languages, and we tell the child that they can't use one language to help solve other problems. They can't use their total language resource. They can only do it in English or the language of school. So it's not a cognitive or a physiological problem that's happening there. It's a psychological one that we have created in the schooling system. And what we need to do is break that down and tell children that the knowledge that they gain through any language is transferable. And they can use that knowledge in any language. They can input it in any language and they can output it in any language. So it's a shared system. It's not located in the same physical space, but instead it's a network of chemical neurons and synapses that can connect together to trigger information. So recent research at the university using brain scans was showing that when key words and phrases were used for bilinguals, that the brain lit up all over the place. All right? And it was a much more extensive network of ideas than the number of neurons and things that lit up for monolinguals. In other words, what bilingualism did, because you're acquiring knowledge in two languages and operating in two languages, creates a much richer network of ideas and connections. And it's those connections between ideas that constitute learning and human development. Right? The more connections you can make within your brain, the cleverer you are. Right? So bilingualism, just because of the way it works and the way we have to think about it in different languages, creates more networks in bilingual people's brains. Right? And therefore, it provides the potential for a much richer body of knowledge. So you could see it like that, as a linked set of neurons, or something like that lights up. So this was quite an extensive study that was done across monolinguals and bilinguals with the scans at the Brain Centre at the university. And overall, it showed these findings. So it's also been reproduced in a recent study showing that learners build on and expand the representations for language and concepts that are already in place. In other words, having learned ideas and used one language, that it sets like a framework or a template in the brain for you. And when you learn another one, you don't begin from a blank brain. You're able to work in the template that's been created by the first language. And so it shortcuts the process of learning about something, dramatically. And it's like the second language helps fill much of the template. So learning a second language bilingually is not like learning one language here that's completely separately from this language here. Those two languages are intimately connected within the brain and our concept system. And what we really haven't learned to do effectively is how to take the best advantage of that. So that makes a simultaneous model of language learning or literacy possible. That's where the theoretical base comes from. It means that rather than thinking that we can only manage one language at a time and we have to complete one completely before we start the other, it opens the possibility, both theoretically and practically, that it's possible to learn two languages at the same time or three languages at the same time, and possible to learn to read and write in two or three languages at the same time. Right? That it won't confuse children, and that they will in fact probably be more effective quicker because they're able to use all of the resources they've got to solve the problems that they're facing. So they can draw on their total language resources rather than just on one. So it's challenging the older ideas that literacy had to be completed in one language before you could start the other. Right? So we'll just then talk about what types of transfer that we know can happen. And this, in the last 2 or 3 years, has been developing really rapidly. And it started off with people thinking that knowledge would only transfer from your first language to English, and that there would be limited transfers. But we've now realised and shown that you can learn something in English that you can transfer back to your heritage language. So you can learn how to do mathematics or something in English, and then you can then do it in French or Samoan or Maori, yeah. Providing somebody teaches you the language items and the words that you need to do that. So that knowledge is transferring from either language. Whatever you learnt it in, you can transfer it to the other. You can transfer those knowledge and those concepts. You have to learn the individual words, and you have to be able to learn to spell it. But this is the list of things that's coming up, and it's quite substantial. Concepts, metacognitive strategies, culturally appropriate ways of working, better understandings of the nature of language, and even phonological awareness, which is the sound systems, comparing and contrasting. And there's some evidence to suggest that the language of bilinguals is improved by working in two languages simultaneously, because the child learns that this is how you do it in this language, and this is how you do it in the other language. Quite a good idea in Te Reo is that the research in other languages is showing that what children do is they transfer from their strongest language the grammatical knowledge of how the language works to the other one. So for instance, in English you say the desk, the table, the pen, but you also say John, Bob, Mary and Hemi, right? And you use and for that. But in Pacific and Maori languages you use a pronoun system. So you shouldn't say John me Bob, me meaning and, you should say John rāua ko, or rātou ko. You should use a pronoun system. But children learning Te Reo will transfer English grammatical strategies into it. And we know that they're doing the same thing with French, and they're doing the same thing with Samoan. So one of the things that a more simultaneous model says to kids is, this is how you do it in English, this is how you do it in the heritage language. They're two different systems, and therefore each language actually improves, because they don't just automatically transfer those things across, because part of the whole study at school is, well, how do we do it in this language, and how do we do it in that language, right? And so there's a lot of evidence that that would be far more effective in improving both languages, and we would stop that random and unthinking transfer of knowledge from English into all of our languages, into all of the minority languages, which is happening really fast, because children will do it unconsciously unless we show them something about how the system works. All right, so what is it that, one of the really important questions is, what is it that transfers? Well, the researchers and professionals, we call it CALP, but it's cognitive academic language that transfers. It's not playground language, it's not chat, and it's not goss stuff. It's cognitive academic ideas. So most school language is actually cognitive academic talk. You know, it's not playground language. So it's not really that writing transfers and speaking doesn't, but it's the way that we talk and we read and we write in school within curriculum areas that makes knowledge transferable. And that's why literacy is so important in bilingual development, because this whole transfer system that I'm talking about only happens if you are literate in both languages. Right? So we used to have a belief that it was possible to become bilingual, but it didn't matter that much whether you could read and write in it. But what we now know is that the cognitive academic thinking that you're required to do to become literate in a language is what drives academic success. So if all we wanted was for our children to be speakers of the language, that's fine, and they can be speakers. They'd be better speakers if they were literate, and they'll be cleverer speakers and cleverer people if they become literate in it. So literacy in this new thinking becomes much more important as a driver of academic success. You know? It's not the bilingualism itself that makes children clever, because there's been extensive research across that area looking at who succeeds in school and who doesn't, and the answer from that research is very clear. The people who are literate in two languages are the people who are clever. Who are the people who come into New Zealand with two really strong literacies? Not only two strong languages, but two literacies. Chinese and Korean students. Literate in their own language. High levels of literacy in their first language. that they then transfer that metacognitive knowledge and strategies to English. Who are the people who struggle most in the New Zealand education system? Those who enter New Zealand speaking a language other than English, but who are not literate in it. Ethiopian kids, Somali kids from war-torn areas, Burmese kids from the refugee camps in Thailand, and to a really growing extent, large numbers of Pacific kids from schooling systems where they have not had the opportunity to become literate in a Pacific language, but only in English. You know? So that's the research argument for it, that literacy makes us clever. It's literacy that makes us clever. Okay, so we sometimes talk about that as being Bix and Kelp, but that's just an acronym for it. It's really playground language and academic language, and that's why people who say, oh well, but you can get English off the TV and you can get English off the playground and English is everywhere, so therefore you grow up and learn English and be clever in it. The answer is no, because what you're acquiring is a conversational form of English, but what makes you clever is literacy in English and cognitive academic talk in English. So unless you learn to read and write in Māori or in English or in Samoan in English, you don't gain the real benefits of bilingualism. All right, so then developing literacy in the two languages can't just be a haphazard mix of how it happens. So what we're looking for and what we're trying to do is work out the various choices and options for becoming bilingual and biliterate, and what might be the best ways of doing that. And the one thing that we do understand is that those two languages and literacy for them needs to be strategically planned. Sure, there will be lots of different ways of becoming bilingual by going to church, bilingual by playing in a sports team that speaks another language, but literacy is much more strategic. There needs to be much more strategic thinking about how to do that, about how much time to give to each language, about when to introduce the other language, and therefore it can't just be left to chance. You can't think, oh well, I've planned the speaking, but you know they'll learn to do it. So the key thing in that relationship is this thing that's called metacognition. Now, metacognition is what you have to do when you have to think about your own thinking. And what's been shown in the research is that bilinguals, when they're involved in literacy, have to think very carefully and strategically about how to do this task in each language. How might I do it in this language? How might I do it in that language? And it's believed to be that thinking about how I do it in each language that makes children clever. That's what expands the network of ideas. That's what links everything up, because all of a sudden what we did and just took for granted now has to be done explicitly and transparently. Because if we're going to do it in this language and then we're going to do it in that language, the child has to become very much aware of the different ways in which he or she can do it in that language, and that promotes that form of thinking that expands the knowledge within the brain and the cognitive systems. So there's a big group of researchers who argue that it's that metacognitive thinking that promotes academic development. So that suggests that learning a language or learning to read in one language only for a long period of time is probably not the most efficient way of becoming clever or literate. And that's a major problem or it's a major issue for the Māori community at the moment, who have adopted an earlier model of literacy that argued that you had to complete one language mostly or fully before you started another. But of course, if you're working just in one language, you're not having to think metacognitively about how you do it. So it's suggesting that many of the real academic benefits, and we're not talking about language maintenance, because that's really important for Te Reo too, but many of the real academic benefits come from having to work at an early age in two languages, both speaking, reading and writing. And it's that's another argument for a more simultaneous model. Okay, so Languages don't have to be learned twice, concepts don't have to be learned twice, but what we do have to do is teach for transfer. We have to show children how they actually take ideas that we've taught them in one language and use them in the other. So in other words, teaching for transfer becomes a major goal of our programs, showing explicitly for children in all aspects of our lives how we do it in that language and how we do it in the other language. And it doesn't matter whether different people do that, but as long as they're working together. So if you're at home and you're, let's say you're Samoan, as a lot of families are, working in the Bible in Samoan and talking with children about the Bible stories, and somebody else, an auntie or somebody else, talks to them about the same stories and the same ideas in English and shows them that they're really the same story and how they can transfer the knowledge from the story over, that will have exactly the same effect. It doesn't have to be the same person, but it does have to be, we do have to be talking about the same concepts and the same ideas. There's no good doing decimals in one language and then percentages in the other at the same time. If we want knowledge to transfer, we'll be teaching decimals in English and decimals in French or Tadil. Yeah. So that the same topic allows us to talk with children about how we're going to do that in either language. All right, so literacy without a heritage language is not adequate on its own, and literacy in English is not adequate on its own. And so biliteracy means having a goal to become literate in 2 languages, to become a fluent reader, writer, and speaker. All right, so what does the research tell us about children who are biliterate early on versus students who are not, right? Or who are monolingual or not? Well, all of the research these days comes down in favour of bilingualism. So we can't find a single researcher anywhere in the world who would argue today, or who would have a paper published arguing that bilingualism is a problem. So although you listed them all on your sheets about the negative views that many people hold about bilingualism, the opposition to bilingualism has completely gone. It's just disappeared. And it's partly disappeared because of the scientific work on the brain and the scans and the other things that have been happening. But there is no reputable academic or publishing journal that would publish an article saying that bilingualism is a problem. So we've overcome one of those major kind of stepping stones in bilingualism, which is really very important. So the next issue after that then is what are the possible benefits of bilingualism, and we've listed those many times, and so have the readers listed those. But the important thing is those benefits only come from reaching high levels of literacy in both languages. Yeah? So it doesn't matter whether you reach those high levels early on or whether you reach them in the middle of schooling, as long as you do reach high levels. If you reach high levels of literacy in both languages, that is what will give us the academic achievement. Now, I know that languages are not just about academic achievement and schooling, because they are also about identity and belonging and remaining members of our families and being able to talk to our grandparents and those things. But those are already well established as essential to our families. What hasn't been well established is what are the academic and cognitive advantages. So we've just summarised them very briefly here. There's communication advantages, there's bicultural advantages, and there's bilinguals show far greater tolerance for people of other religions, cultures and backgrounds than generally do monolinguals. There's cognitive and curriculum advantages. There's raised self-esteem, security in children's own identities, and the experience of rewarding relationships. And there are increasingly financial, employment and economic advantages to being bilingual, enormous advantages. So it comes down to then, what could we all do to build and strengthen our communities who are committed to bilingualism? And that's why I think we should really acknowledge FRENZ tonight, because by getting the various communities within the school and the Auckland area who are committed to bilingualism, we are able to share our experiences, and by creating a pool of people who think that bilingualism is great and being literate in 2 languages is great, it increases the chance that when my granddaughter meets yours, even if yours is French speaking, she's still going to be very open to the idea that her children, or the children that they raise, should know at least 2 languages. Can you see what I mean? So it creates a network of tolerant people about languages. So we shouldn't think that our struggles with our children and our grandchildren are just about our little family. They're about creating a big enough pool of people who think that it's neat and cool to be bilingual, and therefore they will respect other bilinguals who they meet, and other bilinguals will respect them. And therefore we have more chance of our society being bilingual. So I think you have on your table a list of another little form to do, which says list out some ideas your group could consider to cherish and support your students or your children's bilingualism. Not just at school, but family, activities. What is it that we can suggest for each other? And I'll just keep some of the ones up here rolling through for you if you want a couple of starters.
Sorry guys?
Is anyone within your group, is there an idea that you've heard or a suggestion that you think really should be shared? Could you just signal again? And Frank,
Okay.
we'll bring you the microphone.
Georgian.
Big voices.
Sorry, apologies, but my first idea was arranged marriages within the language community.
We'll lock them up and not let them out as well.
Exactly. And another idea was more exposure to the motherland, in inverted commas, which I guess for Samoan language is Samoa, but whereas for French-speaking community could be French, Canada, Pacific, Tahiti, and so on, France. Yeah, let's name all the countries around the world that speak French.
Came up with just be brave and call it all.
Yeah, you wouldn't be surprised, but I am constantly surprised at the number of parents who say to me, oh, I read the book that tells me that if I speak one language to my child and my husband speaks another, they'll grow up perfectly bilingual. They said, we read it, but we can't do it. Yeah. Or people who say, yes, we'll only speak this language at home, but then give up halfway through because the child says, oh, Mum, I don't understand it. Well, the answer to there is, hey, who cares, you know? This is what we do at home, yeah? If we just give up. And then, of course, all those children who abuse us when they're young and grizzle and carry on will thank us, as you will thank your parents for enabling you to be bilingual and having that gift. So children don't know what is best for them. So really, we just have to. They don't. It's like asking children. I hear it all the time with some sections of society. Do you want to come to church with us? You know, and then parents say, well, I'll let them choose whatever religion they like when they grow up. Well, if they grow up without ever going to church and they don't even choose any religion, I'll let them choose whatever language they want to speak when they're an adult. Well, you know, by then it's far too late. All right. Okay. So I just want to show you a very brief little bit about bilingual immersion education, because we haven't spoken much about the programs, but this research is very interesting. This is 650 to 700,000 children across a large number of states in the US, all right? And what it did was it compared the programs. It compared parallel groups of students in different programs and where they ended up within the program. And it has all sorts of things to tell us. So I'll just sort of summarise what we're looking at. Here's the grade years across the bottom up to Form 7 or Year 13. Here's the standardised scores in English and in other curriculum areas. So we can see that our English language bilingual students who entered school often entered and scored on entry about 20% on a standardised English type test. No one's surprised about that, are they? No, but the education system seems to be surprised, causes a deficit and a problem. But of course, if they took their children to Samoa or to France, their English-speaking children would also be scoring less than that, probably 10%. And how long would they continue to put up with school sending home to them a note that says, your child is not up to standard, 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 because there's no way their child could be up to standard because they've just come to school and they're learning in school in another language. Yeah, so most children start off here, and some of the interesting things are, if you follow some of these lines that at year 2, and see which were the programs that appeared to be really successful in the junior school and where they wind up in the secondary school. Right, that's an English withdrawal program, just withdrawing children for ESOL, for English, without any curriculum content. Leaves children without the cognitive and academic knowledge and capacity in secondary school to deal with the demands of the curriculum. So these generally rise until about year 4, when we're learning the language, we're learning to read, we're learning the language. But after year 4 in school, we use languages for learning. We start to use languages for learning cognitive academic ideas and curriculum subjects. And at that time, the having to learn everything in a foreign language or a language that you don't speak well starts to kick in and becomes a problem. So the only students in this study, and it's the only study that's never been critiqued or had any methodological issues with it, the only children who ever reached grade age norms were children in bilingual programs, late exit programs that taught children to read and write in both languages. And they did that not at year 2, not at year 3, not at year 4, but by year 6. So even in the best programs, children are not able to reach a national standard in English at the end of year 2. Right? Just lunacy. Because bilingual development doesn't work like that. So there's a whole set of these models of development that show us that by and large, bilingual students can, in large numbers, meet the same standards as native speakers of any language by between year 6 and year 8 of a program. But it shows us why the year 7 and 8 programs are so important. Because students have often not yet reached those grade age norms and are not secure enough in the language to be able to continue it. And it also tells us why they need to continue, if possible, into secondary school for that. So this is called the Thomas and Collier study. Professor Stephen May at the University of Auckland rates it as the most reputable longitudinal study of groups of bilingual students that has been done so far. So it's a very interesting and a very reputable study. And it also reminds us that we shouldn't be blinded by someone who does a study and says, oh, I studied children in year 1 and I recovered them, to the point where they'll be successful in school. So we really need longitudinal data to show what's going to happen to our students. So we've talked a lot tonight about what happens to our students at Richmond Road after they leave at year 6. And I know from FRENZ 20th anniversary, many of those students have gone on to remain being French speaking, but we actually have no data about that. We have no research evidence for what's happening to students if they leave a primary school program at year 6, to whether they continue to use the languages, whether they meet and marry someone who speaks the languages, and especially important, whether they raise their children in the languages. So I just put that to you tonight. That's our challenge, to devise a schooling system that doesn't just raise children to national standards, but raises children who want to raise their children in the languages that you hold so dear. Thank you very much. So we've time for some questions, or?
Of course, we do have time for questions. Thank you, John. That was amazingly insightful. Questions from anyone to John?
That I, for my children, so that they can advance or benefit from Finnish, is that they should be literate. So it puts quite a lot of pressure on me for doing that. And I was wondering, because it's basically up to me to teach my children the Finnish language. So based on those curves over there, so I was wondering that would that actually, if I can't do that task correctly, would they actually would be disadvantaged in the English-speaking schools. So if only in that case that if I can dedicate my evenings and just try to teach them to read and write is the way for them to succeed, then it's almost like we're like just giving up. And
No,
just focus on the English only, right from the start.
No, Colin Baker's really clear in he is the writer of encyclopedias, and he makes the point that any form of bilingualism is beneficial because what you're doing is adding something to what the student is going to have anyway. So if our children are going to have English, any form of bilingualism will be helpful, and especially the forms of bilingualism that lead to identity, self-concept, belonging, family membership, ability to stay functioning as a member of the family. I mean, those are really important things, you know. So, and then anything after that is a benefit. So his advice is just go for it. Don't worry about whether you're going to do this or do that if you don't have the same facilities that someone else does. But all children would benefit from being bilingual, yeah, however much we can give them.
Thank you.
And his book, we'll put the reference up for you, it's just called A Parents and Teachers Guide to Bilingualism. It's an excellent handbook for parents.
If both of my children are French, if they go in an English school, what is the time of exposure required for them to become literate in French?
That's a really good question. These programs here, the ones that deliver students to here, all have as their basis at least half of the time that a child spends at school in the heritage language. So it's round about 15 hours a week. A child has to be immersed in a language for 15 hours a week to become a native-like speaker of it. That's why our secondary school programs are really sad when students go for 3 40-minute periods a week to learn French or something. I mean, it's just ludicrous, really. You have to be immersed in a language for somewhere around about 10 to 15 hours a week before you can become a native speaker of it over, you know, many years. Yeah. But you can do that by being immersed in it for 5 or 6 or 7 hours a week and then going away overseas and staying for periods of time and living in a country where you could learn to use it. But if you were just working on the basis of what you can access in your community, the rough rule is 15 hours a week of immersion, which is why students can probably learn 3 languages in bilingual schooling and no more, because they just run out of hours in the day. Yeah.
So as part of your 15 hours, do you count also the hours spent at home speaking the native language?
No, that's 12.5 hours would be half a school week. 12.5 to 13 hours would be half a school week. Yeah. So in addition to that, there needs to be time outside that at church, at home, in sports, in community events. Yeah. So it's a 12.5 in a literacy situation, because that's what you asked me, was it?
Yeah. So it means that the children who are going to the Richmond or French primary school, once they left this school and they don't have this bilingual environment anymore, do they lose it all?
Well, it suggests that their academic development in the language will more or less level out at the point at which they stopped being literate in it. If they continue to read books in French, watch French films, and discuss ideas and things with their friends and peers, you know, in French, and go back to France and do those things, it's not a problem. Otherwise, it will just level out at that level. Yeah.
I guess you already answered that. My question was, why only 2 languages, no more than 2 languages? So, for example, I'm Italian. My 2 sons are Italian and Kiwi. They go to school now, and so I mean, it's like I have not much exposure with them. 15 hours. It's quite a long time. They are tired at night. What do I do?
Yes, it's not a problem to have trilingual programs. Hong Kong is currently experimenting with English, Mandarin, and Cantonese, of course. So is Sri Lanka. Just the British Council last week ran a major educational constitutional gathering in Sri Lanka to introduce English, Tamil, and Ceylonese, the 3 languages, for trilingual programs as a way of bringing people together. In French Canada, there are many programs with Italian, French, and English, Mandarin, French, and English, Polish, French, and English. So trilingual programs are not a problem. We know how to do trilingual programs, and you know, we can do it. And it would be a sensible solution for a number of communities to think about doing French English in Te Reo Māori or Samoan English in Te Reo Māori. It would be a great option. And yeah, we do know how to do that, but no one is currently involved in that. But I should say, just in the case of trilingualism, because you can't always get 3 lots of 15 hours a week in school, you have to make other provisions outside school for the children to go to camps, which they live in, sports events, cultural events.
Basically, you said that it's not going to work without the support of the state. That was one point you made. Second point, you said people in power basically are mostly monolingual. So they just don't understand. So they won't act to do anything. So the question is, how do we change that? And one point you make is that being bilingual has also some benefits, personal benefit, and also financial benefit in terms of careers. That might be something that politicians might hear, the economic benefits of being bilingual. Are there some studies, some figures that shows that bilingual kids do better than others?
You mean academically, or
academically, and then in life? In life,
all of these studies here show that bilingual students who become highly literate in both languages and who use both languages for academic learning achieve generally higher levels of academic achievement as a group than do monolinguals. There are always, you know, monolingual students who do, but it depends on the nature of society as well. I mean, it's the European English-speaking population in French Canada that wants its children to learn French, because if they don't, they'll be shut out of the French economy and the Canadian political system and the social life of Canada. So they want their children to be bilingual, to be part of that society, and I suspect that's what's coming here with Te Reo. We want our children to be bilingual in Te Reo because we want them to belong here, you know, and therefore the language is an important part of that.
Kia ora. My first language is English, and my little girl's starting to, she knows Māori better than I do, and I've been teaching her reading and found it much easier to teach her reading in Māori than English because it's phonemic based. Is there evidence or studies that show that if you did start from a language like Māori, which is very phonemic, because a lot of our children are illiterate and can't read because they're teaching through whole language rather than getting them to read the letters. Even the alphabet is extremely confusing because it's not related to the sound of the letters. Like that would be a major thing that would say actually being bilingual is mandatory in our schools because it increases the success overall of our children. Is there any studies out there that support that?
Well, there's lots of studies that say that it's easier to learn to read and write in Māori or a Pacific language that's absolutely phonemic. But whether being able to make the sounds on the page without any understanding of what they mean is reading is what the question is. Yeah. There's a lot of evidence. Stuart McNaughton's did a whole series of major studies in South Auckland and found that large numbers of Pacific children were so-called excellent readers, word fluent, but had no idea whatsoever what the books were about. And he identified over a whole series of studies with our postgrad students that the main issue for most students is comprehension. Yeah. So, sure, being able to make the sounds is important, but being able to think cognitively and academically is what produces clever people. And one of the real problems at this point in history for Māori, and as you know, I've never known me not to comment on it, but the real problem is whether many of the teachers and the students themselves have a level of language high enough to deal with complex academic ideas at the level at which the students are involved. So if the kaiako cannot explain complex thinking and comprehension or in mathematics or science or whatever, but tries to do it in a level of Māori that's less than a native speaker like, then it's likely that the students also will have problems. So that issue was explored by Papa Chris Lohman in a piece of research at Kowhai Intermediate, and he showed how you could strategically use both languages to deal with complex ideas in learning, for which neither the teachers nor the children actually at that point in time had the ability to deal with. So yeah, so that, in my view, is a case for the strategic use of both languages as a temporary measure until both students and teachers, in the case of Te Reo, can deal with high-level, complex ideas that are required for learning. Yeah. So I'm not that convinced that learning to read and write in a language that you don't understand well is going to be very helpful to you. Yeah.
Question in the back.
I had a question regarding the metacognition. I'm just wondering, concretely speaking, how we could use it at home. Is it that, let's say we're taking maths, and we talk about the words in both languages, or this is circle in French, blah, 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 or in a text like introduction, conclusion, we do it in French like this, like that. It's in English. Is it what you mean, or there's something else to it?
No, it's encouraging the thinking. You could still say to the student, mena ke te mahi koe ke roto I te, ke te tuhi tēnā, o ke te tiro atu koe ki tēnā, te he o whakaro ki te mahi tēnei mahi ke roto I te reo Pākehā. So you could still speak to them in French, asking them to think about and discuss with you in French how they would solve that problem in English. Yeah. That is encouraging metacognitive thinking, but if that's the language that you mostly want to use, that's perfectly possible. It's encouraging the thinking about how you do it that's important, not always the language that you do it in. So you know what I mean? We can talk about the challenges of doing this problem in both languages, but we can have that whole conversation in Māori, Samoan, or French. We don't actually have to do the problem in English in order to discuss the issue. But what I'm saying is if you can promote that form of metacognitive thinking by discussing issues and problems and how you solve things with your children in whatever language you want to use at home. Yeah. Yeah, you have to. It's not, all the research is really clear. It's not possible to become a bilingual native speaker by simply the hours that you spend immersed in the language at school. There has to be out of school times in order for that to work. There have to be programmed activities for children to take part in sports or culture or something in the language that you want them to learn. It's no good just thinking, oh, well, we'll just let them choose what they want to do because, you know, we watch Chinese parents, for instance. Chinese children do not choose what they do. They go to piano, they go to ballet, and what do? They wind up as world famous pianists and dancers, don't they? You know? So really we have to structure more the out-of-school activities, the holiday activities, the camps, the wānangas, the marae visits, the stays, the visits to relations, the trips to live with families who speak those languages in a much more organised way in order to get up the amount of time that we're immersed in it. Yeah.
Question here?
John, I often find myself when I speak to my 3-year-old, I'll say a sentence in French and then I'll swim off a quick translation in English. So that's a no-go.
You're shaking my head. No, because all your 3-year-old is going to do is wait for the translation.
I was wondering if with the whole metacognition thing, if I was actually assisting that metacognition. Here's how it works in French and here's how it works in English.
No, it's the discussion about how it works that is important, not the doing it in jumping backwards and forwards. All they learn when you jump code switch, just jump backwards and forwards, is I'll just wait till she says it in my strongest language. Yeah. So we have to have sustained periods of something in each language. Otherwise they will just fall back to the,
In the first year of the bilingual program, is it better to start right away with 2 languages or 1?
Well, I think the thing that we know about it is there's many different ways to become bilingual. That's, I think, what the theme of tonight is. There are programs where students can start straight away in 2 languages, and there are programs where students start immersed in 1 language and stay in it until year 3 or 4, and there are programs where students begin in 1 language for the first year and then switch to 2 languages after that. All of them work. Programs have to be designed for particular groups of students in particular cultures and particular societies for particular purposes depending what they want. I'll give an example. By and large, the Pacific communities that I've had experience with, including our own family, they want children to have English pretty much from the beginning, early on. And they would be concerned if the programs took children to year 3 or 4, you know, immersed in Samoan with no English. They just won't buy that. So that community has a wish to see English early. So therefore it's possible to design programs that will work for them and will be effective for them. Yeah. Yeah. So there is a Te Reo program, isn't there, at FRENZ and School, where students are starting to learn to read and write simultaneously in both English and in Te Reo Māori at the same time, piloting some of the ideas that we've been talking about. I mean, what's developed at Richmond Road over time was developed partly because of teaching and staffing and all sorts of things, but it basically has been an 80-20, which was 4 days, 1 day, and it was more or less a sequential model. Learn to read and write in the Roku language, and then later learn to add English. But the research is suggesting there's no real advantages in having that it would be possible to organise it differently, but just as successfully. But the one thing that comes out of the research is if your goal is fluency in the language, oral fluency and native-like performance, then you want to spend a lot of time in the language. If your goal is early biliteracy, early academic achievement, raise students' achievement because they're at the bottom of the pile and unless we raise their achievement they won't get anywhere, then you might introduce English earlier. So introducing English and the heritage language earlier will raise academic achievement quicker. But it may also carry the risk that the students may not wind up as native speaker-like as their colleagues who stay longer in the language. So it's a bit of a trade-off. But both work.
I have a question. You said that it's important that the kids are taught by people who know that they are bilingual. That's what I understood at some point. So my kids go sometimes to an English school and sometimes to a French-speaking school, and the teacher don't know the other language. So we are usually the one kind of. Is that okay, or you think?
Well, yeah. I mean, I was contracted by the University of New Caledonia to try and design a system for the Numera Court for the Kanak languages and things in Numea. And the thing that I learned there was that there's a French belief about bilingualism, which is really parallel monolingualism. Right? It really assumes that the schooling will run in French and we'll learn other languages as subjects. That's what France seems to think bilingualism is about. But it's really parallel monolingualism. And the idea that you might be using both languages for learning pretty much equally and learning about each language was not something that is accepted at present within many sectors of it. Yeah. Can you see what I mean? So it's fine. If the only way for children to become bilingual is to go to someone else who speaks the language, they should go to them. Yeah. But if we were designing a schooling system, we'd want to design a system in which the children were encouraged to think, talk, discuss and explore the way that both languages worked and literacies worked at some stage in their schooling. So one of the things we shouldn't take out tonight is that there's any one model or one way of doing it. There's many different ways of becoming bilingual, but what we now know is which ways are likely to be more successful for what purposes. So if for instance, the goal of whānau whāneke, I think, and they will correct me if I'm wrong, has for a long time been language maintenance. In other words, Te Reo will disappear unless there are enough Māori speakers in the next generation. So the goal has had to be about producing a big enough group of speakers for the language to have any next generation. And if there's not enough speakers, it doesn't matter how clever they are, the language is going to disappear. But it appears now, from what people are saying, is that Māori is starting to move out of that phase of just wanting people to be speakers, to be wanting them to be clever speakers as well, very clever speakers. So the communities that I work with, including whānau whāneke, are exploring how they might add those to the existing one without any loss of Te Reo. Yeah.
Thank you, John. Look, I think on the behalf of all of us tonight, the FRENZ Association, I think, thank you so much. I think you did well. Thank you so much. Look, we're going to try to do our best to upload the presentation if you want on our website. I'm looking for Michelle, or when do you think we could be able to? The next day or two? So look, if you just want to take the website address, if you're interested, which is www.FRENZ, as FRENZ, school. Here we go, thank you. John, it's over here. And look, have a safe trip home tonight. We'll try to organize, whenever we get some updates from you, John, another conference. I thought it was quite insightful tonight, for what I've seen and observed. So, any questions, any interest, any feedback for John, feel free to send it to where we send you the invitation. You should come back to us, and we'll definitely pass on to John.
And we'll just, perhaps we'll ask Anna if they could close for us as well.
Thank you.